with us, a friend of the show and a very important person when it comes to election integrity, Tim Canova from South Florida. How you doing, Tim?
Thanks. Good to be with you.
So, tell us what went down in Florida today. Give us your whole macro on what you observed, what you thought. The fact that you had the primary today and it wasn't kicked back. Give us everything you got.
Florida was a big landslide for Joe Biden. 4 years ago, I believe Hillary Clinton defeated Bernie Sanders by about 31 points. This evening, it looks like Joe Biden is going to exceed that and defeat Sanders by almost 40 percentage points. I'm not surprised one bit. Part of it is Sanders did not have much of a presence even here in South Florida. He didn't have much of a presence 4 years ago. He only had one field office in all of South Florida. And if he had a field office in South Florida this time, I wasn't even aware of it. So he didn't have a big presence. He did do some TV commercials. I think the messaging was not very popular here. As you can imagine, South Florida has a lot of folks who have fled Cuba and Venezuela, and Sanders couldn't seem to get away from the issue of Fidel Castro. So that might have hurt him a bit. But ultimately, I think where this can be explained is exactly how I think it might have been explained 4 years ago, which is it should be very clear at this point that the electronic voting machines are very easily rigged. I saw a part of your segment with Graham, and there was hardly any discussion about the voting machines being rigged. And I think this really goes back to South Carolina and Super Tuesday, where Joe Biden had a miraculous recovery that everyone tried to explain. Was it the endorsements from Clyburn and Buttigieg and Klobuchar? Was it that the millennials didn't turn out to vote for him? Was it that Republicans crossed over in open primaries? You heard all those explanations. And yet at the end of the day, Biden exceeded his pre-primary polls. He exceeded the election, the exit polls. And Biden couldn't fill a gymnasium while Sanders, while he didn't have the kind of crowds he had 4 years ago, he still had pretty big crowds now and then. Yeah. So the most likely explanation is the one that nobody ever really wants to talk about, which is the voting machines. And near the end of your interview with Graham, it came up and Graham said that the corporate media is complicit. Well, I'm sorry to say, but Bernie Sanders is complicit. He never made an issue of it in 4 years, never called it out. There was ample empirical evidence 4 years ago. I know many election integrity specialists who were trying to contact him 4 years ago. They were trying to contact him after Super Tuesday this year, and nobody could seem to get through. He raises $36 million last month and has the resources to get lawyers, to challenge, to ask to see ballots, but he's unwilling to make an issue of it. So he calls himself a democratic socialist. I think if he were half as committed to democracy as he is to socialism, he would be doing much better in this primary season.
Well, I just want to ask you, what do you say to people who say that, you know, he can't talk about this? Because I get really angry when people say that at this point. I mean, he shouldn't avoid this. That's the whole, he can't avoid this at this point. I mean, it is so blatant. It is more blatant than it was in 2016. We've been following the elections here in California. We've seen it ourselves firsthand. We've seen the electronic machines that aren't the open source at all. And they lied to us the entire time, telling us that they would be. We've seen the way the California Democratic establishment has pretty much hid themselves away and protected themselves from being held accountable to this, and how the laws, in a way, protect them as well. What do you say to people that say that Bernie Sanders can't talk about this?
Yeah, I've heard Bernie's playing five-dimensional chess, and he'll address the voting machines after he gets elected. Well, guess what? He's never going to get elected. No progressive will, as long as they rig the elections.
Yeah,
it's not an important issue. It's the most important issue.
Yeah.
All the other stuff is pie in the sky. Medicare for all, Green New Deal, all pie in the sky. Never going to happen as long as you've got a corporate oligopoly, basically, that controls the Democratic Party and our elections. It's the most important issue, period.
Yeah.
He has the resources. He could ask to see the ballots like I did.
Yeah.
He could expose and educate and agitate. He doesn't. He chooses not to.
Yeah. You know, it's funny. This is why I'm always been a Tim Canova guy, because of this issue. And I was speaking with an election integrity activist this morning, and I said, well, me and Tim Canova even disagree on a point to the fact that I think Tim wants to go, from what I remember our last interview, or the interview before the last, that you want to go to complete hand counted. I'm of the point that I still want to embrace technology. I want to one day vote online. So I want, at least, at the very least, open source. Don't you agree? And I probably know you will want to have hand ballot, but at the very, very least, a GPL, a general public licensing, maybe blockchain technology, the fact that we have publicly funded elections, it should be owned by the people and never by corporations?
Well, that's true. The software should be open source. We have 3 private corporations that pretty much run the elections all over the country. ES&S, Election Systems and Software, is probably the biggest one. And if I ask anyone in our movement, so to speak, who's behind ES&S, they'll shrug their shoulders. They have no idea. It's owned by a private equity firm called McCarthy Group, based in Omaha, Nebraska. And good luck finding any information about a private equity group. It's not like even a publicly held corporation. So we've entrusted the keys to the kingdom, the supervision of our elections, to 3 shadowy private companies without any real oversight. And yes, while open source would be an improvement, and so essentially having the public sector administer the software instead of having these 3 vendors, that would be an improvement. But I am skeptical of relying at all on technology at this point, because it is so easily rigged. I've got election integrity folks. They think the panacea are the scanned images. When those paper ballots are go through scanning machines and they take images, well, there's going to be an image for every single vote. Good luck. Who has the resources, the money, and the time to count 1 million votes in Florida? It's probably close to 2 million votes in Florida today. Nobody has those kind of resources. Now, what they have done in Columbia County, New York, 2 hours north of New York City, small county, but it's an interesting model. Dr. Virginia Martin, Democratic election commissioner. There's a Republican counterpart. It's bipartisan, 1 Democrat, 1 Republican. And for some years now, they have to count the votes by machine, by electronic machine. It's state law. But then those 2 commissioners have a post-election audit, which is a hand counting of 100% of the paper ballots. Takes a few days, I think, but what that does is it puts the machine or whoever's running those machines on notice that if they're rigging the election, there's going to be a problem. It's not going to come out synchronized with the hand counting of the paper ballots. Here in Florida, I asked to see the paper ballots. The supervisor of elections threw them out. Felonies under state law, federal law. These are requirements to hold those ballots for 22 months. Criminal penalties under state and federal law. And there was no investigation by criminal justice authorities. There was no reaction by Bernie Sanders or any U.S. senator or congressperson. And I wrote to every single one to let them know. So Bernie Sanders losing in a landslide today, he earned it. He earned it. He was oblivious for 4 years about the kind of election rigging that goes on in the state of Florida. Did he really think he was going to come in here and they wouldn't do it to him?
Yeah. And so what is where do we go from here? Because I still feel like it's not only Bernie Sanders. You mentioned nobody else is really talking that much about it. Tulsi Gabbard has touched on it with the Securing Our Elections Integrity Act. She's like the sole person that has, but nobody else is really touching on it. And not only people in Congress and our government, but voters. I mean, it took this time around for some of the Bernie supporters that I know to be like, oh my God, yeah, this is rigged. This is again, this is it. This is happening again. So what's it going to take for people to pay attention to election integrity? And also, where do we go from here when Bernie isn't really talking about it? What is the movement going to do?
So what it would take to engage voters and the public and get them to open their eyes and see this as an issue would have been for Bernie Sanders to make it an issue over 4 years. Over the past 4 years in the presidential debates. He chose not to do any of that. And it marginalizes all of us who are working for really fair elections and transparent and verifiable elections. Yeah, you can't blame the American public and the voters when the leaders in a top-down media system decide to ignore this issue. And why? He's afraid of being called a sore loser? He's afraid of being called a conspiracy theorist? What kind of leader is that who's afraid? He should be leading on this issue. And because he didn't, I think Super Tuesday was rigged for Joe Biden. South Carolina probably was. I'm not saying Biden didn't win South Carolina or some of those Super Tuesday states. I just find it unbelievable. He won the states he won by those enormous margins. And that states that he lost by rather narrow margins. I mean, really, almost every pre-election poll had him in third or fourth place in some of these states. And he exceeded those pre-election polls by a mile. He exceeded the exit polls by a mile. And Bernie Sanders goes on, his response is Medicare for all. That's his response. That's not a movement leader.
Yeah.
You're right. Tulsi did better. Tulsi at least introduced paper ballots. Maybe if Tulsi had been in the last debate, she might have brought up rigging. Who knows? Yeah. But, you know, until there are leaders willing to stand up for this, millions of people figure, why bother voting?
Yeah. I mean, let me tell you something, Tim. We haven't shut up about this. This particular network right here, we haven't shut up. And if you look at our Twitters and stuff, I mean, the other day after the Democratic debate, I was doing little small tweets like, hey, breaking news, you can't have criminal justice reform because we don't have election integrity. Hey, breaking news, you won't get a Green New Deal because we don't have election integrity. It's uber important. But I also think the whole system as itself, not just the machines though, Tim, you've experienced stuff in Florida. We saw it in Los Angeles, the operational point from the front end. It's like they're almost on purpose making sure they have a chaotic system that breaks down and suppresses the late vote, right?
Right. So well, I agree. And I think the voter suppression, which Bernie has alluded to, there weren't enough voting sites in Michigan and in North Dakota. To me, I think those are almost intentionally out there as distractions. As long as we're talking about the lack of voting sites and that kind of suppression, we're not talking about rigging of electronic voting machines.
Can't we talk about all of it? I mean, it's one of the things I talk operations, the laws that are in effect, the lines, getting that system. Because we know if Chick-fil-A can serve a ton of customers with their all crazy lines, then we can do this for elections too. They're jamming it up on purpose. And then we talk about the software, the counting, whatnot, and then the audit process, which you just kind of mentioned. They do 100% counting. I mean, I would accept 50% audit at this point right now. You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, how do we move the discussion there?
And the audits that exist in the state of Florida are a joke. And when's the last time, other than me, you've heard of a losing candidate say, I don't believe it, I want to see the ballots? None of them do this. All of them should. You know, where do we go from here? The irony is, what's the one presidential candidate who has really spoken about paper ballots other than Tulsi Gabbard? Donald Trump. Yeah. Donald Trump was tweeting about it a year ago. If Bernie Sanders had spent the last 4 years making it an issue, and the Democrats forcing this as an issue. Instead, what was it? 4 years of Mueller investigation, an impeachment over a phone call, anything but discussing how rigged our election system is.
Yep.
And then, you know, color me shocked. It's 2020 and the same thing is happening, only even worse.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think is going to happen, I guess, on our way to the convention? Because it seems like the Democratic establishment and Tom Perez are punishing people now for postponing the primaries further than June. I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic. They are telling people that they can't be in crowds of 10 or more. Do we think that we're still going to even have the chance to go to a convention?
I don't know. I've thought about it and wondered the same thing. My guess is as good as yours. But ultimately, I think, so what? If we go to the convention, it'll be deja vu all over again. Bernie will have his moment up in the podium where he'll get to talk about Medicare for all, and he'll get to talk about a Green New Deal. He won't talk about the rigged elections. And of course, he won't talk about the rigged elections. It'll be his moment to basically say that Donald Trump is a racist and a sexist and corrupt, and that's why we all have to pull together again, this time. Maybe not behind Hillary Clinton. Maybe it's Joe Biden. Maybe if Joe Biden's cognition is not good enough to get through the convention, they replace him with Hillary Clinton or someone else. They're not going to replace him with Bernie Sanders, though.
Yeah.
But, you know, this is what we're looking at. is, you're right, a truncated primary season because of the coronavirus and the lack of ability to have big rallies, and maybe a convention even that's kind of a truncated convention because you don't want a lot of people in the same, proximity. You got to do the social distancing. But it'll be televised, and Bernie will be up there to tell people to vote for Joe Biden or whoever. And, we'll talk about Donald Trump like he's so corrupt, even though they've spent $30 million, and I'm not sure what corruption they actually found. And yet the corruption of the Democratic primary process is in our faces.
Yeah. I do think, though, that a lot of Bernie supporters are actually not going to listen. They're very angry. Speaking from someone that's always around them, they are saying, we are not voting for Joe Biden. We don't care if Bernie Sanders says that. They're mad at Bernie for not going after Joe Biden at that debate. It was Bernie's chance to literally say Joe Biden isn't mentally capable. He's not mentally there. He can't be a leader, to go a little bit more aggressive, and he didn't do it. And a lot of his supporters are very, very disappointed. So I think we're going to see a little bit of the pushback from the Bernie Sanders supporters, the camp, the progressive wing, say no. And I think if we can at least do that, I think the good thing is we will see the complete demise of the Democratic Party. And that it's going to take everybody saying we're not voting for Joe Biden, though.
Fiorella, that might be. I don't disagree with that. I will say this, though. Had Bernie gone for the jugular in that debate with Biden and really undressed him, and I don't think it would have made a difference for Florida or Illinois because they rigged the voting machine.
Right.
So, and if Bernie knows that, why would he want to go out there and make so many enemies in the establishment when he spent 4 years trying to build his bridges back to them? I think he knows he's losing. I think he knows he's losing illegitimately because they rig the machines. He can't be oblivious to this.
Yeah, I agree.
So he knows it's happening, and he doesn't want to get blamed for Biden's defeat to Trump. So he better use kid gloves a little bit. He's playing a role. The role is to champion some left-wing causes, to stake out what's acceptable left-wing causes also. And acceptable to progressives on the left, you could say. But I don't think it didn't surprise me he didn't go for the jugular. He should have been making an issue of these rigged elections for 4 years. I can't emphasize it enough. To me, it is malpractice. He doesn't deserve to be the leader of a national movement, for a democracy movement. Fine to call himself a socialist Democrat and to be talking about economics and social policy. But when it comes to democracy, it should be about the legitimacy, the transparency, the fairness of the vote. And he is AWOL on that.
Well, what about your thoughts? Because I was talking to some friends the other day, and I want to send a shout out to our boy Mike Unge, because he always said that the strike one for him was the way that Bernie Sanders handled Tim Canova after the Democratic convention in 2016. In other words, it was like, okay, this is the person taking on Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Now there's a pivot. He doesn't even exist, and a lot of people remember that. But you had mentioned before that you thought maybe he was threatened at the convention around. We played a Trump video where Trump was around a bunch of consultants in a room, and they were like, one of the consultants said, they took him in a room. They gave him in the locker room. They gave Bernie a speech. They gave him a talking. Do you think that's a strong possibility that the deep state, the CIA, the intelligence community, is that threatening and overbearing that they kind of push Bernie Sanders in a way to say you have to play by these rules, and it was impossible for him to win that game?
Yeah, it's possible. It's possible. What other explanations exist? I'll tell you something. I saw Tulsi Gabbard being interviewed on Jimmy Dore recently. And Jimmy asked her a direct question. Have you been in touch with the Bernie Sanders campaign? You're the two progressives in the race. Shouldn't you be coordinating? The establishment coordinates. WikiLeaks showed that the DNC was coordinating with Hillary. Have you heard from Bernie? And it sounded like Tulsi reached out, and her answer was no. It was a simple no. It was no explanation, just no. And to me, that was deja vu all over again. So what kind of a movement is it if the movement is all about his campaign? And it's an impressive money-raising machine, $36 million last month, an enormous list of supporters. But if he's not willing to stand up for election integrity, whether it's in a congressional race in South Florida from somebody challenging his nemesis in 2016, or whether it's standing up for his friend, Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, supposedly his friend. I know he says Joe Biden's his friend now, but he hasn't stood up for Tulsi Gabbard when she was being smeared.
Yeah. I mean, that also can't be ignored. And Tim, I don't know if you know very much about the Bernie Sanders campaign, but a lot of the campaign staff this time around is even more centrist at the top. We've dealt with it here in LA. They completely ignored all of our attempts to say there is going to be a huge issue in LA with the provisional ballots. There's going to be issues with the machines. People aren't going to be able to vote, etc. And they completely dismissed what we were saying at the LA level. And I've also seen it kind of happen in other states. But unfortunately, you cannot run a grassroots campaign with a lot of these Center for American Progress establishment like people at the top. And it's a very top down structure that this campaign had. And I think they were targeting the centrist vote. They were trying to get a lot of these Warren voters, a lot of these people to kind of vote for them. And simultaneously, they pushed away a lot of the independents and libertarians that they had in 2016 that were pretty much, you know, the Midwestern white working class. And I think he lost a lot of that because of the change he made. If you look back at the ads in 2016, Tulsi Gabbard was talking about regime change wars when she was pretty much a Bernie surrogate. And she was addressing all of the issues she's addressing in her campaign. Plus, Bernie was addressing all of the working class issues. So it worked really well. If they had stuck to that, I think they would have been doing a lot better, to be honest.
I agree with you. There's no doubt that his 2020 campaign has lost a lot of momentum compared to 2016. Perhaps you're right. I think he kind of, I think he engaged more in identity politics kind of campaigning than he did in approaching this in a way that addresses the issues of class that transcends race, that cross racial and other types of boundaries. I always thought that was a mistake, a strategic mistake in this campaign.
Yeah.
But again, perhaps he's taking a certain lane, doesn't want to hurt the party too much. He knows what the outcome's going to be beforehand. I tell you, before Super Tuesday, a dear friend of mine was getting the Bernie fever again and calling me up and saying how, you know, look at the crowds, look, he's winning the debates. He's got all the momentum. Look at how much money he's raised, and Biden's raised hardly anything. Organizationally, he's strong. He's going to do it this time. And you know, I said I don't believe it. I think they will rig the machines against him on Super Tuesday, and I think they did even a week earlier or a few days earlier, excuse me, in South Carolina. So I hear what you're saying. I do think his organization is more centrist. His message is more identity politics. But the real fatal flaw is that we have a system of rigged elections.
Yep.
I don't think it deserves a presumption of being fair and unrigged. It just doesn't deserve that presumption. And it didn't deserve that presumption coming out of 2016 and 2018. And then again, when you look at the actual pre-election polls for South Carolina and Super Tuesday and the exit polls, it doesn't deserve that kind of presumption. Yeah. Now, I think those who want to sweep this under the rug in the interest of defeating Donald Trump are very naive at best. We are in the process, I shouldn't say we, the Democratic Party is in the process of nominating a very flawed candidate and somebody who I don't think can defeat Donald Trump and even keep the House of Representatives Democrat. When you start playing those kinds of political games that you know it's rigged, but you've got to suppress the truth in the interest of winning, you're going to lose, and you're going to lose with a lie, not with the truth. What this country needs, more than a social democratic movement, more than a left-wing movement, it needs a democracy movement. It needs a democracy movement that spans left and right. And a democracy movement should be centered around the legitimacy of elections. We don't have that right now. Yellow vest sounds great, but I was part of Occupy Wall Street in the LA area, Occupy LA. And I saw how easy it was for a Democratic administration to sweep us off the streets when they just decided it was time. It was no longer politically useful for them. I have a hard time believing in our country that, and especially with the kind of mass surveillance that now exists, for a yellow vest movement to succeed. And it pains me to say that. I'm not sure what it will take to start changing things. I would say to start changing things, what it will take are federal prosecutions. There should have been a federal prosecution of Brenda Snipes for destroying the ballot. She should have been given a choice. You either go to prison for, I think it was up to 5 years in prison, or if you want a plea bargain, start talking, start discussing, start telling the truth about how these elections are rigged. Start building cases against corrupt officials. I am rooting for the Bar Justice Department to start bringing prosecutions against those who lie to a FISA court. I don't care if it's Democrats or Republicans. There should be no room for this kind of political corruption and using the FBI and the CIA in the election process. It wasn't just Donald Trump who was spied on by the FBI and the deep state. My campaign was. Tulsi Gabbard's has been. You're not going to win any elections by just concentrating on the kinds of issues that the Sanders campaign has focused on. We need a democracy movement. And perhaps the first step is just speaking the truth about that. Yeah. And when folks want to talk to me about a Green New Deal or about Medicare for all, and that Sanders should have been clubbing Biden over the head with, his votes on the bankruptcy bill or something, I'm sorry. The response has always got to be these elections are not legitimate. There's no reason to have any confidence in any of these election outcomes, in the actual results being legitimate. Every European democracy has banned these electronic voting machines. Shame on us for not making this an issue. For not making this the only issue, the main issue.
Let me ask you a question here, because we talked about this before, because we've been talking to some people in Florida, and Brenda Snipes is gone, and I believe you guys had a new elections official in Florida together, right? Ron DeSantis took over as governor. And by the way, we talked about what a message you sent to Mr. Andrew Gillum with his issues and his problems that's going on. But Ron DeSantis won that election, and I think a lot of people had some hopes that Ron DeSantis would straighten out some of the election issues within Florida. Have you seen any sign of that, or is this once again more or less more of the same old BS where the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are working together?
Well, before DeSantis actually won the election, when the race for governor and the race for U.S. Senate were both had crashed in Broward County, you might remember, in November of 2018, in the days right after the election, the hours after the election, Broward County had not completed its counts. There was machine recounts in Broward County. And after Governor Scott was deemed to have won the Senate seat and Ron DeSantis was deemed to have won the governor's race, Scott was still the governor for a couple more months. And he then fired Brenda Snipes and replaced her with an interim elections chief named Peter Antonacci, a Republican. And I went and visited with Antonacci for an hour. In the room next to him was only one other aide, and the aide he chose was somebody who was the right-hand person of Brenda Snipes. So Antonacci had not done a house cleaning. In fact, Brenda Snipes had ordered the destruction of my ballots. They were carried out by the supervisor of one of the supervisors, or a deputy supervisor, I should say, named Dozell Spencer. And he was still basically on the payroll. When I called Antonacci on that, he said, well, he's not technically on the payroll. He's just a consultant for us now. So there's numerous people from Brenda Snipes' operation that were not swept out. And I handed Antonacci a copy of our election challenge, which documented what was wrong with these machines. All of these electronic voting machines have wireless cellular modems on them. So it's not even a back door, it's a front door to actually hack in and with just a few, I'm told by the experts, 5 or 6 lines of software, source code can be changed, and you can get any election results you want. And Antonacci's response to me was, well, these machines have been approved under state law by the state election commission. So nothing's changed. Nothing's changed.
You got another question?
No.
So I got another question, because we talk about the open source, closed source. We talk about the machines itself. And I think the start is to have those discussions. There are people who believe that, like I said, get away from it, whatnot. Talk about the operations point of view with everything that happens before we get to the counting machine. There are some who strongly believe, and so do I, since there's a lot of registration problems which push people into provisional ballots. You witnessed it in Florida. We witnessed it here in California. Wouldn't open primaries cut that problem by 75%? Because now if it's an open primary, we don't get a provisional ballot because it's an open primary, number one, and it would also force one side to talk to the other. What are your thoughts on that?
I've always been a supporter of open primaries, and I think what you're articulating makes sense. By having an open primary, too, it means the Republicans would be more concerned about election rigging in blue counties like Broward, and the Democrats would be more concerned about election rigging in red counties all over the country. I think sort of what seems to have happened here is that you look at the election map of the United States, and 90% of the congressional seats have been gerrymandered, and they're safely blue or safely red. And it's almost like the mafia, where the two parties sit down and the Democrats can do whatever they want in Broward County, as long as the Republicans can do whatever they like in their red counties. Yeah. And then every now and then there's some swing counties, swing districts, where they really are up for grabs, I guess. But by the Republicans deciding not to investigate and prosecute Snipes, that's exactly what they're doing. They're saying Broward is blue. We don't have a chance to really crack it open, so we're not going to rock the boat there. And I suppose if it was an open primary, there'd be an incentive for both parties to monitor each other a little bit more closely all over the country, and not just in the swing districts. That's what makes the general election for president so interesting. The Democrats can rig their primaries and with apparent impunity. And then when you get to the general election, they might be victim of that kind of rigging.
Yeah.
There are election experts that tell me that there's some counties in Wisconsin that went for Trump that they suspect the machines were rigged for the Republicans. In many ways, it comes back to what we've been saying for a long time, which is the Democratic Party has a primary objective and a secondary objective. Their primary objective is to defeat progressives in the primaries, is to defeat grassroots insurgents in the primaries. Their secondary objective is to defeat Republicans in November, but it's only a secondary objective. As long as they achieve the primary objective, the corporate money will keep coming into the party, and the revolving door will continue between the party, big corporate interests, lobbyists, and big media.
Yeah. Do you have anything else, sir?
No.
John, you got a question? Well, Tim, that's all the time we have for you right now. Listen, I just want to say thank you. You took a lot of shit when this stuff went down years ago, and a lot of people turned their backs on you, and some of us kind of hung in there. And I think a lot of things are coming to light right now, and maybe next week or in a couple weeks, if it does happen, if Bernie does endorse Biden, I think a lot more people are going to understand that these elections were rigged, they were and it's time to get on that wagon to let's fix our elections. And I certainly appreciate you holding the line on this, Tim. Really, I mean, like I said the other day in that text, I wanted to tell you now, you've inspired me to do good, despite when people say, hey, man, what are you doing when you're saying this, when you're speaking up against the powers that may be? Thank you for really holding the line when it comes to election integrity and making it a strong fight.
I mean, yeah, I think definitely this is going to be a continuation of that. We are going to continue that movement for sure.
Thank you both, Craig and Fiorella. I appreciate you having me on, and I appreciate what you're doing by trying to speak the truth about these kinds of issues, about the most important issue facing this country. If we're ever going to reclaim this democracy, we need a democracy movement. And I appreciate that the two of you have kept your eyes on the ball and that you're speaking the truth. And that's not an easy thing to do in this day and age. So thank you so much.
Yeah. If we ever had a democracy, it seems like just,
Truly.
you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Tim Canova. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to come on back. That was Tim Canova talking about election integrity. He's in Florida. Stuff that wasn't addressed 4 years ago wasn't addressed today, and that's why we're in the mess. Tim says it. It's the number one issue.
It really
I've said
is.
it. We've said it. It is the number one issue because no matter what you want, we can't have it until we have some election integrity. That's just it.